found Rose standing alone. She looked smaller and more inconspicuous than usual, he writes, as if her son's tragedy had somehow shrunken her. But she was outwardly calm. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Davis, but don't worry. Everything will be all right. You'll see. Now it's Bobby's turn." To me, this is troubling. Her saying it's Bobby's turn at this moment is particularly insightful. Not that it's, a year later or, it looks like he's coming into his own. I bet it's his turn. Not that, just that we just buried my son, the president, so now it's Bobby's turn. Like today, even if we say, well, we all could say weird things in grief. Okay, that's true. We do say weird things in grief, but this shows the instinct of the woman. Hello, you guys. Good morning to you and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I am Jess Cannell and I would love to earn your subscription. I have two things to share with you this morning. One is that I went on a podcast over the weekend. So go ahead and go look for the link in the show notes. I was on the Solving JFK podcast with Matt Crumpton. And if you haven't encountered that podcast, you should check it out. I've been going back and I started just kind of like peeking at topics where I know that I need some shoring up for understanding in the case. And for me right now, that's been the JD Tippett portion of the case. So I listened to his whole portion of that and it was fantastic. But now I'm going back and just listening systematically through his podcast. One of the nice things about the first couple of seasons of his podcast is that everything is cited to the nth degree. So you can listen knowing that the information you're getting has been carefully sourced. So I'm hoping to have Matt on my channel soon to specifically talk about his experiences. He actually got to go to Capitol Hill this spring and he was not testifying before Congress, but he was a witness present behind Oliver Stone and Jim DiEugenio, and he was sourced by other news media about the JFK document drop. So I'm hoping to bring him to you sometime in the next couple of months. We're working out our schedules right now. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Now we are getting back into this book, The Kennedy Men. And many of you have mentioned you're enjoying it a great deal. I am too. I love learning through stories. And I had somebody last week say that basically I sounded like a library reading. And I had to laugh. The thing is that for basically 20 years, I have read to children, my own children. And so I'm definitely not trying to infantilize my audience, but I think it comes naturally for me to pause and make sure that whoever I'm reading to and myself are keeping up with the story. For me, the recaps are helpful. Making sure that I'm putting it in the proper context is helpful. It's helpful for me. So I hope that I'm not making you feel that way. That's not my goal. But I love learning through story, and I hope you do too. I think it's actually a really relaxing and connective way of learning. Connective meaning it helps me connect many different dots. It helps me understand the psychological profile of the character or the story that I'm listening to. And so today we are actually starting at the time of the funeral of JFK. We have just walked through the Dallas very hastily, I might add. Most of our other videos about the JFK assassination certainly take a more leisurely pace of looking at particular pieces of evidence or articles or books that have been written. This one was a few pages on the Kennedy assassination in a book that's entirely about the Kennedy men. But now we are to the part where Joe has just watched the nationally televised funeral for his son, the president, alone. The rest of his family went to Washington. The autopsy on the president was so botched that it left a permanent legacy of doubt. Doctors at Parkland in Dallas had wanted to conduct the autopsy there, but the Secret Service insisted on removing the body and returning it to Bethesda Naval Hospital. This actually states it weaker than it actually is. Dr. Rose, who was a Texas medical examiner, he was insisting merely that Texas law be followed. Any murder in Texas had to first have the body be examined by a medical examiner before the body could leave the state. And so the actions of the Secret Service did actually violate Texas law at that point. Since this time, murdering the president has been made a federal crime so that then they could deal with the body however they wish. But at this time, they did actually violate Texas law. So it was not just that doctors wanted to, but that actually the proper methodology would have been for his body to remain in Dallas until it had been examined by autopsists and then could be transported to wherever the family wished. Bobby apparently allowed the autopsy to go forward without a forensic pathologist. It's also believed that he was responsible for the disappearance of vital organs and tissue samples that should have been kept for future study. In spite of her grief, Jackie knew instinctively that she had to go on for the sake of her children. It talks about her talking to Theodore White in that initial magazine interview. Before the funeral, Jackie wrote a farewell letter to her husband and told Caroline, "You must write a letter to Daddy now and tell him how much you love him." Caroline printed, "Dear Daddy, we are going to miss you. Daddy, I love you very much. Caroline." John was not old enough to write, but he signed Caroline's letter with an X. Their letters were placed inside the president's coffin. Yes, this portion of the facts of the JFK assassination are part of what embedded it further in the heart of the American people. It wasn't only a terrible injustice witnessed and chronicled by the American people and experienced as an assault against the vote of the American people, but it was also against a father and someone of whom we all had admired as a people. We all had admired his darling children, so we all felt deeply this grief. The day of the funeral was John Jr.'s 3rd birthday. Another terrible detail. And although many people suggested his party be postponed, Jackie insisted that it go along as planned. 2 days later, on Caroline's birthday, Jackie gave another party. Of course, all of us adults were in tears, recalls one witness, but not Mrs. Kennedy. She did what I couldn't have done. The president's body lay in state in the East Room of the White House, flanked by an honor guard representing each branch of the armed forces. One observer saw Bobby enter and throw his arms over the coffin and start talking to his dead brother. "It broke my heart," he recalled. Well, it certainly would. And you know, when you have a military man, he would have regarded this, regardless of his politics, you regard the person in office as your commander-in-chief. And there is a sense of duty that I think, even at this time, regardless of your politics, if you have given your life to your country in military service, you would regard the murder of your commander-in-chief as a personal assault, as something done against the country to which you've sworn your allegiance. And so they would already have that. But then to be listening as a brother. There is a brotherhood among military men, and of course anybody who has their own brother would feel that moment very deeply. A horse-drawn caisson bore the body of the slain president to the Capitol Rotunda on Sunday. On Monday, a 21-gun salute was fired, while 50 jet planes flew overhead. A solemn requiem mass was celebrated at St. Matthew's. Now for the story that proves that real life is stranger than fiction. It takes us back a few months to Labor Day weekend. It's shocking when you first discover that JFK had actually rehearsed his own assassination just a few months before it happened. It was during Labor Day weekend in 1963 that the president, a James Bond fan, joined with friends to make an amateur film not far from Hammersmith Farm in Newport, Rhode Island. As a Navy photographer filmed, Jack comes off of the boat, the Honey Fitz, the presidential yacht, walks down the long pier, and then suddenly clutches his chest, fell over flat along the pier. A beautiful woman, Countess Consuelo Crespi, and her young son emerged from the yacht and stepped over him as they walked toward shore. Next, Jackie came out, and she too stepped over Jack's body. Finally, his friend Red Fay came along and pretended to stumble over the body, and as he did, he fell on top of Jack. Red liquid spurted from Jack's mouth. One journalist remembered that when he wrote about this home movie, Kennedy was absolutely furious. He liked to keep what he considered his private life separate from his official life. Well, if it was in terrible taste for me to write about it, he thought, it was in terrible taste for the president to do it. And Kenny O'Donnell agreed, even more so after the actual death, right? But it's just odd, isn't it, that he would have done this just months beforehand. There's a quote actually by this Kenny O'Donnell, aide to the president, and it's printed on a presentation at the 6th Floor Museum, where Kennedy actually spoke about his own death, reportedly the morning of the assassination. So was he obsessed with it? Was he getting lots of briefings saying that his life was in danger? Whatever the case, there was a lot of death that he particularly was bringing to the forefront in the months beforehand. The effect of the assassination on Joseph Kennedy can only be imagined. The founder of the dynasty, incapacitated by stroke, could not communicate his reaction, and the family could no longer benefit from his counsel. His 1961 stroke broke his body, but the assassination of his son broke his spirit. After this, he gave up. And this is interesting and important because sometimes in movies we are given the impression, for example, I think about the movie Chappaquiddick that was done, an excellent movie. It does a good job, I think, of communicating the essentials of that book, Chappaquiddick. Is it there? There it is, Chappaquiddick. We went through that last fall, and it was a fantastic book, very investigative, very thorough, very cited. But in the movie, one problem that existed was that they showed Joe Kennedy as if he was kind of like basically all there, but just couldn't communicate his thoughts. And so almost like if you've ever seen the Nativity story, they show John the Baptist unable to speak because, of course, he had been, if you don't know, when the prophecy was given to him about John the Baptist, he asked a question of the angel. And because of that, he was mute until the time that John was born. And so in that movie, they show him kind of communicating via a slate. Like he just is mute, but he can communicate perfectly fine and all of his thoughts are ordered and all of that. And I feel like that's sort of the way that Joe Kennedy is presented in the movie Chappaquiddick, as if he's fully cognizant, he's fully interactive, people are still looking to him to lead the family. He just can't actually speak his thoughts. But based on the way that the Kennedy Case by Rita Dallas, she was his nurse, the way that book speaks about his state, and then this book as well, it seems that that's inaccurate. That there are certainly times that he communicated his displeasure or his interest in something through sort of tantrum-like behaviors. But it was not as if Jack or Bobby or Teddy were coming in during, after 1961 and having these big moments with him and really seeking his counsel, and he's giving some communicative, deep interaction. he was able to, show interest in something or show displeasure in something, but that's sort of the extent of his communicative capacity, is my understanding. Rose's dynastic ambitions remained undimmed. After the funeral, guests returned to the White House to celebrate John's third birthday, and John Davis recalls that before leaving, he found Rose standing alone. She looked smaller and more inconspicuous than usual, he writes, as if her son's tragedy had somehow shrunken her. But she was outwardly calm. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Davis, but don't worry. Everything will be all right. You'll see. Now it's Bobby's turn." To me, this is troubling. I mean, we're going to see it again with Ted at times when he wishes to kind of make his own way and isn't given that privilege. So her saying it's Bobby's turn at this moment is particularly insightful. Not that it's, a year later or, it looks like he's coming into his own. I bet it's his turn. Not that, just that we just buried my son, the president. So now it's Bobby's turn, like today. That's really soon to be making that mental transition. And to give grace, it's possible that she's just letting down her guard and trying to mentally transition. Nevertheless, it shows the instincts, right? Even if we say, well, we all could say weird things in grief. Okay, that's true. We do say weird things in grief, but this shows the instinct of the woman. JFK was buried at Arlington on Monday, November 25th. The following Thursday was Thanksgiving Day, and most of the Kennedy family gathered at Hyannisport. Only Bobby and his family couldn't face it. In the aftermath, a wave of memorializing that verged on canonization would begin. It's widely accepted that Jackie, in her sessions with reporter Theodore White, first compared the Kennedy administration to King Arthur's Camelot when she told how the president had loved to listen to the album. The mobster Mickey Cohen was more earthy than most in expressing his admiration for the slain president. Listen to his admiration expressed, but also the accuracy of his statements versus the canonization that we sometimes get. He says, "I don't want to take anything away from John Kennedy being president. Needing broads 2-3 times a day doesn't take away from him being president. I admired Kennedy because, well, the SOB was not only a man, he was all man, and that's good. If a man's got to get laid 3 times a day, fine and dandy. He was a guy just like me." I think that's actually a more accurate picture to the man in some ways than some of what was done. That's not to say that the statesmanship didn't deserve credit. It absolutely did. I look back to the wisdom displayed during the Cuban Missile Crisis and think there's not a man in 10,000 that could stand up to the scrutiny, the pressure, the demeaningness that came at him from those in the security state toward him, and that was also simultaneously happening towards Khrushchev from his warmongers. That the two men navigated those waters and got through it without nuclear war, saved the lives of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people. That's no small thing. It also kept us from war at a time when both sides were kind of burning with resentment to the other. To navigate waters like that and to do it through diplomacy, through backroom conversations, through really vulnerability toward the other leader is remarkable. Whatever other things we might admire about Kennedy, to me, that is one of the greatest achievements that he did personally, that he navigated on his own and made his way through in a way that was good for the world. So very admirable. But also, as we've been talking about with this book, we have to balance that view of what a remarkable statesman, what a grasp of world politics, what a capacity to navigate difficult things with wisdom, compassion, foresight that is an act of love towards your fellow countrymen and fellow residents of the world. But alongside this side of Kennedy, that he was an unfaithful husband. He did transmit STDs. He did constantly go through women, and he was not a saint. He was not an orderly man in his private affairs. We have to hold both in tension. Nevertheless, it's worth mourning and pausing to pay honor to a man who did our country well, and not only that, but suffered the great injustice of the death that he suffered. Injustice in the sense of it happening at all, injustice in the cover-up that came after. That kind of underscores the injustice of his death. Part 4 of the book is called After Camelot. Herodotus is quoted here: "All arrogance will reap a harvest rich in tears. God calls men to a heavy reckoning for overweening pride." Chapter 11 is called Bobby's Brief Moment. So now we get a look at Bobby. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend recalled life with her father, RFK. "We had to be first in sailing and skiing races. We had to beat our opponents in tennis and get more runs than the other team in softball. And if we didn't, he'd get mad, very, very mad. It was made clear that we weren't to take these sports half-heartedly." So in that regard, RFK was transmitting the same sort of competitive nature that he had grown up with. For 10 years, Bobby Kennedy had devoted himself to his older brother's career. Now Jack was gone. All the power that they had commanded was now in the hands of Lyndon B. Johnson. Inside his office, Bobby would sit staring at the window. "I was the 7th of 9 children," he once said, "and when you come from that far down, you have to struggle to survive." Friends noticed that he began to unconsciously assume Jack's mannerisms, his cigar smoking, even donning an old tweed coat of Jack's. Truthfully, I don't know how you couldn't do this as a brother. Bobby's obsession with Jimmy Hoffa had continued throughout his term as AG. As Professor Monroe Friedman wrote, "From the day that James Hoffa told RFK that he was nothing but a rich man's kid who never had to earn a nickel in his life, Hoffa was a marked man." But by the time Hoffa was convicted of attempted jury bribery in early 1964, Bobby no longer cared. His mental and emotional energy was concentrated on psychological survival. Jackie moved with her children into the Georgetown mansion of Avril and Marie Harriman. They happily turned their home over to them while Jackie planned her future, and they just moved into a nearby hotel, which is so accommodating. It's so gracious of a couple. We'll step aside, you take the house back over. Jackie was trying to do everything possible to maintain continuity for her children, but Washington soon became impossible. There were buses of tourists. People would point out, "This is the home of Jacqueline Kennedy." And it just was awful for her. So she got out of Washington. On November 29th, 1963, this would be 1 week after the assassination, Lyndon Johnson appointed a presidential commission chaired by Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren and including 2 senators, Richard Russell from Georgia, John Cooper from Kentucky, and 2 congressmen, Gerald Ford and Hale Boggs from Michigan and Louisiana. Hale Boggs, I didn't know this before, but have recently learned he was the New Orleans representative. And so there are some sketchy details about him in regard to his death that I hope to look into. If you have good articles about that or good leads for that, please point me in that direction. But this commission was appointed to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy. Also on the commission were John J. McCloy, the former head of the World Bank, and Alan Dulles, former director of the CIA. Among the young investigators supporting them was Assistant Counsel Arlen Specter, who was an assistant DA from Philadelphia. He is the one who came up with the single bullet theory or the magic bullet theory. If you want a great look at that, at the end of last week, there's a video that goes through the JFK eyewitness accounts. But at the beginning of that video, we go through the number of bullets that were described by the Warren Commission and why it got down to the point where he had to propose the magic bullet theory of there being one bullet that made 7 wounds in both men. So if you're interested in that particular topic, we've recently gone through that in Robert Groden's book, JFK Absolute Proof. Bobby told the Warren Commission investigators that, quote, "I would like to state definitely," this is pretty clear, "I would like to state definitely that I know of no credible evidence to support the allegations that the assassination of President Kennedy was caused by a domestic or foreign conspiracy." That's pretty clear. Jackie soon realized the importance of creating a family unit apart from the larger Kennedy family. She recognized that children would get strength from grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, but it was growing up with a feeling of stability in their own family that would give them the support that they needed. So in September 1964, the three moved to New York to a 15-room apartment on Fifth Avenue that overlooked Central Park. When she learned that Caroline's classmates at the Convent of the Sacred Heart were not inviting her to their parties, she called the other mothers and told them that she understood that they probably didn't want to make it seem like they were all inviting Caroline simply because she was famous. But after all, Caroline's only a little girl. And after that, Caroline was always included. John, meanwhile, was enrolled at St. David's, a Catholic boys' school. Caroline recalled this time this way: "One of my mother's favorite times of the year was spring in New York when the ballet came to town. She would let my brother and me stay up late and take us to each New Year's production. The world of classical dance with princes, sorcerers, cruel spells, and true love was very real to my mother, and we all lived in that magical world each time we went to the ballet." Gradually, Jackie grew closer to Bobby, who replaced her sister Lee as her confidant. You know, it's interesting. We're about to get into their connection and reported affair in these years, particularly in the year following Jack's assassination. However, I do think this is trauma bonding. And I think particularly in this case, as you look at the forces of government that were against them, and likely the details that both Jackie and Bobby were privy to, that they likely were sworn secrecy to, or because of their own safety and the safety of their children had to maintain secrecy about, my guess would be that there were many things that only the two of them knew or spoke about with others. And that would be very comforting in that moment, to have someone who you could let your guard down with. So, you know, we've talked in the past about the trauma bonding process. But I think even in this situation, the more that you understand the nature of the JFK assassination, it makes all the more sense that having someone with whom you could just be real and speak frankly would be such a mercy at this particular moment. Insiders were speculating about the true nature of the intense friendship with RFK and his widowed sister-in-law. Taki Theodorakopoulos, or Taki, I think, Taki Theodorakopoulos, who was involved with Lee Radziwill and sharing an apartment with Peter Lawford, recalls that Lawford confided that Bobby and Jackie were having an affair. Now we get into the odd story of Mary Pinchot Meyer. We get a page about that. So let's dig in. On October 12th, 1964, this is not quite a year after the assassination, Mary Pinchot Meyer became another Kennedy intimate to die mysteriously. A 44-year-old woman, she was murdered on the towpath near her Georgetown studio, apparently shot in a botched robbery. A young man was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. as previously mentioned, I think 2 or 3 episodes ago, she had confided to her friends James and Ann Truitt that she was having an affair with the president and keeping a diary about it. Truitt was then vice president of the Washington Post. I mean, that's the funniest part to me of these confidences that are happening with journalists. It shows the absolute degree of trust that existed, that you would feel like, oh, I can tell the vice president of the Washington Post this huge, massive secret, and it'll totally be kept, no big deal. And it was. His wife, Anne, was a sculptor and a confidant of Mary's also. Truitt had been sent to the Tokyo bureau of Newsweek, and before they left for Japan, Mary discussed with them the disposition of the diary in the event of her death. She asked the Truitts, we're told, to entrust it to James Jesus Angleton, chief of counterintelligence for the CIA. The Truitts were still in Tokyo when they received word of the towpath murder, but the Saturday after her murder, 5 other friends, including Angleton and his wife, Cicely, gathered at her Georgetown home to search for her diary. They knew that Mary usually left her diary in the bookcase in her bedroom, where she also kept clippings about the assassination of JFK, but the diary was not there. Angleton combed through her deep, narrow townhouse, but it was her sister Toni who finally found the diary in Mary's studio. It had been locked in a steel box filled with hundreds of letters. She turned it over to Angleton and asked him to burn it. According to a November 12th, 1995 letter, he followed this instruction in part by burning the loose papers. He also followed Mary Meyer's instruction and safeguarded the diary. So was it to read through and pick out certain pages and burn those? Was that truly her instruction? Those questions are still open for me. I have a couple of books actually already that would probably give me the answers to those questions. I just haven't had time to dive into that because I'm still very heavily investigating the JFK assassination. But eventually, I want to get to the story of Mary Pinchot Meyer. Nevertheless, he follows this instruction, supposedly, and years later, it says he honored a request from Toni Bradley that he deliver it to Toni, her sister. Subsequently, Toni Bradley burned the diary in the presence of Anne Truitt. On July 19th, 1965, Raymond Crump went on trial for the murder of Mary Meyer. There are very odd circumstances around Raymond Crump. This man did not seem to have anything to do with this death. I believe he was found asleep. And there was the testimony that he had actually met up with like an illicit girlfriend and they had had a little tryst in the woods, after which he fell asleep and he was basically woken up to the arrest. So I do know that much, that the circumstances of this man's arrest seemed very odd. He had not tried to flee or hide. He had no evidence connecting him to the attack on Mary Meyer apart from just having been in the park, semi near where she was found. But again, if you had done something like that, you know, would you go over and take a nap near the place that you had murdered a woman? That doesn't make any sense. The case went to the jury, which took less than a day to reach a verdict of not guilty. The acquittal left Mary Meyer's murder officially unsolved, and Washington police never reopened that investigation. But the affair continued to be a secret, known only to a tight inner circle, until it became a headline of the National Enquirer in 1976. 14 years after the murder, the National Enquirer published a story headlined, JFK 2-year White House romance. Socialite then murdered. Diary burned by CIA. The main source for the story was James Truitt. The former publishing executive had been motivated, he said, by Ben Bradley's lack of candor in his own book, Conversations with Kennedy. Here's this great crusading Watergate editor who claimed to tell everything in his Kennedy book, but really told nothing. So he's saying, look, if you're going to publish a book called Conversations with Kennedy, and you are going to claim that you have told everything, that it's a tell-all book, it's going to really reveal the man, and then you don't include this important detail, forget that. Stop doing that. You're not some crusading truth warrior. You're a man who's playing with the truth and presenting to the American people falsehoods. I tend to be of that mindset as well. I definitely understand, especially for those who were closest to the center of this thing and how many deaths had happened, that people might feel the need to guard themselves from harm, number one, to guard the people that they love, and to be cautious about the legacy of the president. I understand those desires and how they could rule someone, but then you can't claim tell-all book, right? It's one or the other. The Post's reaction to the story was to smear Truett, citing a doctor's certifications that he had suffered from a mental illness, quote, such as to impair his judgment and cause him to be irresponsible, end quote. Journalists wrote about the subject and concluded that the Post created the hard impression that Truett was an unreliable source, even though Bradley knew that Truett was essentially truthful about Mary, Meyer, and JFK. This story is still unresolved. If you're interested in the title of those two books, one is called A Very Private Woman, and the other is called Mary's Mosaic. I have heard that Mary's Mosaic is more like a chatty, unsighted novel. So if you want data, you may wish to go towards A Very Private Woman. But I will also say that A Very Private Woman is primarily about Mary Pinchot Meyer's life. And so I did start reading that one. It's very fascinating. She has an interesting beginning, but I got far in and yet didn't get to her murder. Just got an overview at the beginning, not the actual details. So the focus of the book is quite different. So if you're interested in only the account of her death, then you may just want to read articles or that book. If you have another recommendation, if you happen to love this topic and have a recommendation, put it in the comments below for people who are also interested in Mary Pinchot Meyer. Bobby also began to take up other prerogatives of Kennedy men. Sometime in the early 60s, he and Ethel had befriended the singer, Andy Williams, and his beautiful French wife, Claudine. The two couples skied, sailed, and traveled together. And by the time he was elected to the Senate, observers were convinced that Bobby and Claudine, who was 15 years his junior, were lovers. Years later, in an interview, Claudine did acknowledge that they shared a special closeness. Here's her description of their relationship. She said, "We could talk in the way a girl and a man can talk, the way women are almost never able to talk, not chit-chat. When Bobby died, I lost interest in the Kennedys. There was no one for me to talk to. I drifted away. There was just no one there." Bobby now found himself locked in a power struggle with Lyndon Johnson and Hoover. Once Johnson announced that no member of his cabinet would be eligible to run as vice president, Bobby took the hint. And on August 22nd, 1964, he announced that he would run for the Senate in New York. He was elected that November. "I have absolutely no presidential ambitions," Bobby declared hours after he was sworn in as a U.S. Senator. 6 days later, Ethel delivered their 6th son and 9th child. For the next 2 years, Bobby, now recognized as the heir apparent, spoke out on national issues and traveled frequently abroad. From 1965 forward, his anti-Vietnam position would become more pronounced, and he increasingly addressed the problems of blacks, the poor, and student radicals. There were rumbles of change among the Kennedy women. The shy and quiet Jean, who had written so charmingly to Marilyn Monroe, had suffered in silence as her own husband, Stephen Smith, fully embraced the Kennedy rules by his wildly indiscreet philandering. But in 1965, she took a lover of her own, the brilliant, troubled, and many times married lyricist Alan J. Lerner. With his creative partner, Frederick Loewe, they had created some of the most popular Broadway musical comedies of all time. And their 1960s hit Camelot, of course, became Jackie's choice of metaphor for her husband's administration. For once in her life, Jean was showing a flash of the Kennedy wild streak, and she courted exactly the same kind of danger that they had. According to Lemur, the lyricist rented a yacht that August while his newest musical previewed in Boston, and that boat became a floating love nest for the two of them. At least until Lerner got a call from an angry Bobby Kennedy who advised him, "Stop seeing Jean or we'll fix your gondola." That summer, Jean left her husband and two sons behind while she went to rendezvous with Lerner in Paris. Lerner never showed up. On her return to New York, he sent her a letter ending their affair. Jean reconciled with her husband, and they subsequently adopted two daughters. Jean Smith has denied this story. Her sister Pat also tried to strike out on her own. A year after Jack's assassination, she separated from Peter Lawford. The issue was his drinking, drugging, and womanizing, and on December 17th, they signed a legal separation agreement. A month later, she appeared before a local judge to petition for divorce on grounds of mental cruelty. Pat's only son, Christopher, took the collapse of his parents' marriage very hard. He was 9 at the time, and the dissolution of their marriage meant the end of his life among the movie stars of Southern California. I mean, that puts it like he's really into the whining and dining of all the people. It just took him away from his life, right? Like, we need to see this from the eyes of a child. Maybe that mattered to him. I'm sure he did feel the glitziness by the time he was 9 somewhat. But 9 is actually still relatively young. And the main thing that he's missing is not the glitz of the stars, but the intactness of his family, the connectedness and the sense of home that he would have had prior to this collapse of his parents' marriage. So to say he took it very hard because he was moving away from the movie stars trivializes a very significant moment in his life. Patricia moved to New York City with Christopher and his 3 sisters, Sydney, Victoria, and Robin, but now he would grow up closer to his male Kennedy cousins, hell-raising with Joe II and Bobby Jr. and David, especially David. Bobby took time out in 1966 to attempt to suppress a memoir about Jack. He got an early look at the manuscript of Red Fay's The Pleasure of His Company and became irate, demanding that Fay cut 40% of the book. Fay refused, but he did prune a few bits. I'll say, actually, that I have come across an antique copy of that book, and because of the title, The Pleasure of His Company, I did think kind of it would be a fawning praise of the president, but now this makes me actually curious, like, I wonder what it actually says. I wonder if that's something worth reading to get a better look at the man, because Red Fay was one of the men who had been, I believe, on the PT boat with him and remained close with him. We just read about how he was one of the ones who participated in that, like, faking of the president's assassination in that home movie. He was one of the people mentioned as having spent time with them on that Labor Day. So he remained Jack's friend from the time before America really knew about Jack Kennedy all the way through his death. Bobby's power base was growing, and by 1967, he had the largest staff in the Senate. He also had the largest Kennedy family. On March 24th, Ethel gave birth to their 10th child, which broke Rose's record. And I will just say, if you have seen my reviews of Shiny Happy People, I don't believe in competition about numbers of children. I think that's a really unhealthy way to view it. The difficulty of pregnancy in the life of a woman, the issue of loss, pregnancy loss, stillbirths, miscarriage, the issue of infertility that affects many, many women. These issues are so deep in the heart and so out of anybody's control that making a competition out of it is really stupid and heartless, I think. But it does seem that the Kennedys at least had some measure of competition about it, because I've seen it mentioned in other places that Ethel beat Rose, basically. The weekend of June 17th also saw Bobby and Ethel celebrating their 17th anniversary, unaware it would be their last anniversary to celebrate together. By the mid-60s, Bobby was determined to unseat President Johnson. In January 1968, Bobby announced that under no circumstances would he be a candidate for president. But after Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota took 20 of 24 delegates in the New Hampshire primary, he reconsidered. 4 days after McCarthy's victory, Bobby declared himself a candidate. I do not lightly dismiss the dangers and difficulties of challenging an incumbent president. But these are not ordinary times, and this is not an ordinary election. 2 days later, he denounced the Vietnam War, saying, our present course will not bring victory, will not bring peace, will not stop the bloodshed, and will not advance the interests of the United States or the cause of peace in the world. 15 days after Bobby declared, on March 31st, Lyndon Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election. So there would not be an incumbent president. 4 days later, Martin Luther King was murdered in Memphis, which I had not realized that all of these things were in such close succession. You can almost see the underworld. If you believe that the 4 assassinations of the 1960s in America are all connected somehow, that JFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert F. Kennedy are all connected, then we have to look at the underbelly of power. And you can almost, just reading the last couple of paragraphs, you can almost see what must have been the frantic scampering of the underbelly of power when everything is happening with Martin Luther King's appeal to the American people and his persuasion that he was able to wield, the way that he combined a deep understanding of classic literature, of biblical language, of persuasive appeal, and then just appealing to the moral conscience of America to join his view of the civil rights struggle, alongside Bobby now stepping up to the plate, and then Lyndon Johnson exiting the field. It would be an absolute shakeup of power. The fact that MLK is murdered amidst all of this is even more troubling to me. It helps me understand better. Not just, of course, we all know that any death is a tragedy, any assassination is a terrible tragedy, but the timing of it is so intense, so deep, so clearly aimed at avoiding transition of power to me. Let me know what you think in the comments. On that night, Bobby broke the news to his supporters at a rally in Indianapolis, and my understanding is that his compassion and empathy and his honoring of MLK really was what cemented the hearts of much of the Black community to rally behind and support Bobby. Some of them still held concerns that maybe he really wasn't with them, but his understanding of Martin Luther King Jr. and his honoring of him that night cemented that relationship. In the years since her husband's assassination, Jackie had been seen publicly with a number of admirers, including historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Privately, she often entertained Onassis at her apartment. He courted her with diamond bracelets tucked inside floral bouquets. In May 1968, Jackie was a guest on a 5-day cruise in the Caribbean aboard Onassis's yacht, the Christina, and during the cruise, Onassis proposed. When she returned to the States, she immediately consulted with Bobby, and he reacted this way: "For God's sake, Jackie, a thing like that could cost me 5 states." The rest of the family was equally appalled, and for Bobby's sake, Jackie agreed to postpone the engagement until after the presidential election in November. When a reporter asked Rose about all the money that the Kennedy family was spending on Bobby's campaign, she snapped, "It's our money, and we're free to spend it any way we please." And that's true. There have been a few different wealthy individuals that funded their own campaigns for president. I mean, one of them is our president currently. But I believe that Ronald Reagan was probably in that camp. Let me know the others that you know about of wealthy individuals who financed their own campaigns even more than donations or appealing to the masses. I would be interested to know that, to understand that better. On June 4th, the day of the California primary, Bobby and Ethel were staying at the Malibu home of a director friend. For relaxation, the family went swimming in the ocean, and their son David actually disappeared under the waves for a bit. Bobby immediately dived in, and for a minute, too, he disappeared until he bobbed to the surface holding David. He gently warned his son about the danger of going out of his depth, which is an ominous warning given what's going to happen on this day. That night, after he was declared the winner of the primary, Bobby spoke to cheering supporters in the embassy ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel. What I think is quite clear is that we can work together. We are a great country, an unselfish country, and a compassionate country. I intend to make that my basis for running. After his victory address, he exited the stage from the rear and he takes a shortcut through the pantry. He was going to the room where press folks were waiting for a news conference, but he had only gone a few feet when Sirhan Bashir Sirhan, a 24-year-old Jordanian, fired 8 shots from a .22 caliber Iver Johnson revolver from a distance of 4 feet. 3 bullets struck Bobby. I mean, the way that they say it is like all of them were fired. My understanding is that Sirhan did fire at RFK, but then he was restrained, and even still, his finger kept pulling the trigger until the gun was emptied and kept pulling the trigger beyond that. It appears likely that he was in some sort of hypnotic or psychologically maybe medicated state. He doesn't remember the moment of the assassination, and his Robert F. Kennedy's son, RFKJ, does not believe that his father was killed by the bullets from Sirhan. And in fact, it appears very clear that the bullet that actually killed RFK that lodged in his brain came from behind, which is impossible because Sirhan was standing, I believe, 6 or 8 feet in front of him. That is an assassination that eventually I want to get into and understand better. But right now we're here understanding the Kennedy story and understanding the JFK assassination. But at some point I do want to dig into the RFK assassination as well, because there are clearly, I mean, even the document drops that were announced this spring of JFK, MLK, and RFK documents all being related makes me feel that not only are they connected potentially, but that also the circumstances of each are likely not what they have been presented to be. While Bobby was rushed to the hospital, Stephen Smith took the microphone on the ballroom podium and quietly asked the crowd to leave, at which point news reports start going out. Teddy learned the news in San Francisco, where he was campaigning for his brother. He immediately flew to LA. RFK's children learned the news in various ways because some of them were there with Robert and Ethel that day, but some were in other places at boarding schools and such. It was not until dawn that Ethel, from her husband's bedside in the hospital, asked family friends to account for all of the children. President Johnson immediately sent a presidential jet to LA to bring Bobby's body back, along with members of the Kennedy family, to New York City. Ted selected the coffin and remained with it during the flight. Teddy delayed calling his parents. Rose, who had been rising at 6 for early mass, got the news from her radio. So Teddy delays, and thus Rose is put into a new form of shock because of his inaction. We had this discussion, and I'm sure we're going to get there when we get into the Chappaquiddick story, but in the book Chappaquiddick, Leo D'Amour lays out the timing of how the morning went after the car accident. And one of the key pieces that I think makes more sense in light of this is that Joey Gargan is insistent. You have to be the one to tell your parents. Your mother does not deserve to get the news in any other way. I wonder if it goes back to this moment that she learned about RFK from the radio. Joe, who was helpless in his bed, listened to Ted report to him on the phone. Senator Robert F. Kennedy lay in state at St. Patrick's Cathedral for 2 days. One unfortunate note is that Peter Lawford had been invited to the funeral as a single, but he shows up at St. Patrick's with a young woman he had just met. She was clad in a micro mini black skirt, and she was impossible to miss, clinging to Peter Lawford's arm. Thereafter, he was cut out of the Kennedy family completely. So he had achieved his full usefulness. He had served JFK. He had been president, getting connections for, the Kennedy men to Maryland. But now the Kennedy pattern is in full effect, and he has now been discarded. Joe II and Robert Jr. served as altar boys, and Ted insisted on giving the eulogy. With the assistance of one of Robert's speechwriters, a few minutes after 10 a.m., he spoke. "My brother need not be idealized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life, to be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it." A 21-car funeral train took Robert to Washington. They reached Arlington National Cemetery at nightfall, and a parade of mourners carrying candles followed the coffin into the graveyard. Bobby was buried 20 feet from Jack. The surviving Kennedys, now well schooled in the principles of a dynasty, were already looking to the future. Joe Kennedy's daughters were trapped in their roles, of course. Eunice, who everybody agrees is the best politician, is, of course, barred from seeking political office because she's a woman. For Jackie Kennedy, the death of Robert Kennedy was the last straw. She decided to bolt. She was now going to pursue life on her own terms. By fall, an incredible rumor was beginning to spread. And on October 17th came a brief statement. Mrs. Hugh D. Auchincloss. I realize now somebody corrected me in the comments that I've been saying it wrong. I've been saying Auchincloss. Apparently it's Auchincloss. Mrs. Hugh D. Auchincloss has asked me to tell you that her daughter, Mrs. John F. Kennedy, is planning to marry Mr. Aristotle Onassis sometime next week. The only comment from the Kennedy camp came from Teddy, who said, "I talked to Jackie several days ago. She told me of her plans, and I gave her my best wishes for their happiness." What was not said was that actually the romance, the courtship, and the hard bargaining preceding the engagement had all been carried on in the utmost secrecy. Late that August, she and Ted secretly flew to Scorpios, and while Jackie's son, Ted discussed the matter of money with Onassis. Ted explained that if Jackie remarried, she would no longer receive any income from the Kennedy trusts. When Jack died, she had inherited approximately $70,000 in cash, his personal effects, the Cape Cod house, and the income from his trusts, which amounted to $200,000 a year. In return for agreeing to marry Onassis, she asked for and received a cash payment of $3 million and $1 million for each of her children. In return, she gave up all claims to Onassis's estate. To seal their engagement, he gave his bride-to-be a $1.25 million engagement ring. They were married on Scorpios on October 20th before 21 guests, who included Caroline and John and Ari's grown children. At a lavish wedding dinner that night, he presented all of the women with gold bracelets. The wealth on display here is shocking. You're all given gold bracelets. Gold bracelets for everyone. Around on me. And the men were given gold watches. It was raining. Jackie, 39, was solemn in a long-sleeved ivory lace Valentino dress with a matching ribbon in her long, dark hair. Onassis, 3 inches shorter and 23 years older than his bride, wore a dark blue suit, white shirt, and red tie. His children, Alexander and Christina, made no secret of their disapproval. "It's a perfect match," said Alexander. "My father loves names, and Jackie loves money." That's pretty cutting. The world was shocked by the marriage, but not Jackie's family. Her cousin John Davis said those of us who had grown up with Jackie felt that Onassis was precisely the type of man that she would marry. He had noted that she always liked older men, even as a teenager, and he said, we all knew that her mother and father had relentlessly coached her to marry a very rich man. Friends were sympathetic. Her longtime friend Joan Braden said he was fun and different and felt safe, and she was always looking for protection. I just want to note that apparently Diana, Princess Diana, had gone to Jackie at some point for advice after her divorce from Prince Charles, or perhaps while it was in process, and gotten advice about this situation of seeking not just privacy, but financial means that could afford real protection when you are the woman who has been in a very public situation and is now on the outs in some way. So Jackie, I think, counseled Diana to seek the same. Given Diana's choices, that's what's understood of the matter. Jackie had already taken steps to remove her children from the Catholic schools that they had been attending. By marrying a divorced man, she knew she risked excommunication, and she didn't want them to suffer for it. So she removes Caroline from Sacred Heart and takes her to Brearley. John was transferred to Collegiate. And Vatican sources said this statement, which is interesting. The case of the former Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy is closed as far as the Roman Catholic Church is concerned. She is barred from the sacraments as long as she remains married to Mr. Onassis. Isn't that very strange? How very strange that would be to go from being the centerpiece of the Catholic world in 1963. If you've ever gone through the 6th floor museum, or if you've looked through the old memorial editions of the JFK funeral, what you see is not just Americans mourning. You see the world mourning because he was our first Catholic president and Catholics were all around the world. And so news of his death reached into far-reaching places in the world who were not only thankful for his statesmanship, but perhaps many of them were even primarily connected with him because of Catholicism. And so she was at the core of that as the primary widow that everyone was focused on and praying for and empathizing with, like the Catholic in chief's wife to some degree. And so how weird for her to go from being celebrated and venerated almost to being, quote, barred from the sacraments, and that the case on her was closed until and unless she's no longer married to Aristotle Onassis. Just, it makes for a very interesting analysis of Jackie, what she was willing to give up, what she was willing to kind of just trade, like this no longer has value to me at this particular moment, and I'm opting for this instead. So she trades out the Kennedy name, she trades out Catholic, good standing for greater protection, perhaps greater freedoms, in her mind, perhaps greater privacy, and potentially a chance for love. There is the view that she really loved Ari. So you guys let me know what you think of this reading. The next part that we are getting to is part 5, the rise and fall of Cadillac Eddie. So we're going to get into Teddy Kennedy. Let me know what you think of the Bobby years, of his quest for the presidency, his strong principles, whether or not he had an affair with Jackie, and then of course his tragic death and the aftermath that followed. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will look forward to reading. You guys have a great day. We'll be back tomorrow with more of the Kennedy men. See you then. Bye.